The subcommittee will come to order. After recognizing myself and Ranking Member Deutsch for 5 minutes each for our opening statements, I will then recognize other members seeking recognition for 1 minute. We will then hear from our witnesses. Without objection, your prepared statements will be made a part of the record, and members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. Today we are here to discuss the President's budget request for the upcoming fiscal year 2018 for the Middle East and North Africa region. While I have always been an advocate of being efficient and effective in the use of American taxpayer dollars to fund our foreign assistance programs, I believe we have many good programs that should not be cut just for the sake of scaling back. To be sure, there has been plenty of waste, fraud, and abuse that needs to be addressed, but those should be addressed specifically, not simply by an across-the-board cut. But let's start with some of the positives. The current request represents $3.1 billion in foreign military financing, FMF, assistance for our closest friend and ally, the Democratic Jewish State of Israel. This level is consistent with previous obligations and represents the final year of the previous 10-year Memorandum of Understanding, MOU, between the U.S. and Israel. We need to honor our obligations and guarantee that Israel is able to maintain its qualitative military edge, QME, over its neighbors. I'm also pleased to see that the budget request honors the commitments we made to our ally, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, under the current MOU between our two countries. Jordan remains a vital partner in the fight against ISIS, and its stability and security are top priorities for the region, for our ally Israel, and for the United States. This will be the final year of the current MOU, and I have authored a bill alongside Ted Deutsch, Nita Lowey, and Hal Rogers that would authorize a new and expanded MOU for Jordan to ensure that the king can keep his country safe, continue fighting ISIS alongside us, and expand his economy. I strongly suggest for state to adequately address Jordan's economic and security needs as it examines the new MOU, which hopefully will be for 5 years, in order to reaffirm our long-term commitment to the Hashemite Kingdom. I'm also happy to see that the request for Israel's economic assistance has been reduced, not because I think Egypt doesn't need any economic assistance, of course it does, but because we still have a considerable pipeline of unobligated money in the hundreds of millions of dollars from previous years that we have yet to spend. I see no reason to continue to ask taxpayers to add to that pipeline until we can clear out that backlog, and if that money cannot go out the door in Egypt for whatever reason, then perhaps U.S. interests would be best served if it was reprogrammed elsewhere. And by elsewhere, I suggest Tunisia, which brings us to the bad in this budget request. First, I'm extremely disappointed to see a request for continued assistance for the Palestinian Authority. I know we will hear how none of this money goes directly to the Palestinian Authority, or that a lot of this money actually goes to Israel to pay off the PA debt, and that we're doing important humanitarian assistance in the West Bank and Gaza. But we all know that money is fungible. For every dollar of PA debt to Israel that we pay, that frees more funds for Abu Mazen to pay the salaries of terrorists. And it means that even though we continue to find that the PA and the PLO have not lived up to their obligations, they continue to incite violence, and they continue to support terror, and they continue to work against the interests of the Palestinian people. Rather than holding them accountable, we are rewarding them with continued U.S. assistance. Another disappointment in the budget request is for Tunisia. Tunisia has been one of the very few positive developments in the region over the past few years. It's not without problems, of course, but any country going through a transition like Tunisia in an earnest effort to become a democratic society is going to have some hurdles to overcome. Now is not the time to cut and run. Now is the time to double down on Tunisia, that is at the forefront of fighting terrorism, as it has to deal with the problem of foreign fighters coming from Tunisia. This year's request seriously undermines Tunisia's economic progress, and it completely cuts out all FMF assistance to a country whose security and stability are vital as it struggles to stay on a path toward democratic governance. Tunisia is not the only country that lost its FMF assistance under this request, which calls into question the dramatic shifts the administration has taken in the FMF program itself. I hope we hear more about this global FMF fund, which I believe is something like $200 million for everyone, and how the administration plans on distributing that and its plans for moving to loans rather than grants. I worry this may be a move by the administration to remove the State Department and therefore our Foreign Affairs Committee out of the foreign military sales realm by cutting FMF, yet making these countries eligible to receive Defense Department-funded security assistance. And though this is not a part of the budget request, this also calls into question the State Department's role in the Saudi Counter-Terror Center. And with Secretary Tillerson in the region at the moment, and with the announcement of the out of this Riyadh summit, it raises questions regarding the agreements we just signed with Qatar and how we will fund our commitments. There are also many questions that this budget request conjures up, and I have great concern with many aspects of it and how this budget will promote America's interests and help bring stability and security to the region. And with that, I'm pleased to yield to the ranking member, my friend, Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thanks to Ambassador Jones and Ms. Lange for being here today to discuss the administration's proposed FY 2018 budget. Excuse me, Ambassador Jones, I especially want to thank you for your distinguished career serving this country in some of the most challenging environments. And while we wish you well in your retirement, which I understand is coming in just a few short weeks, this country is losing a great diplomat, and we are grateful for all that you have provided to us. Let me say that we appreciate the relationship that we have had with your respective bureaus. We hope we'll continue to work together to address the very real challenges facing the Middle East and North Africa. And I want to commend the remarkable Foreign Service and career personnel serving at both state and USAID. We are fortunate to have tremendously talented people who are willing to dedicate their lives to public service, often in dangerous conditions, and we are grateful for that service. That said, I am deeply concerned that senior level positions at both state and USAID have yet to be filled. I'm concerned that while both of you are extraordinarily capable of doing your job, you are still filling an acting role 7 months into this administration. And I continue to read articles that refer to no one being home at the State Department. That is not a good message for our friends, it's not a good message for our allies, and it is a terrible message to send to our adversaries around the world. Diplomacy and development should be driving our foreign policy decisions, not taking a back seat to whatever decision the President cedes to the Defense Department. State and DoD should be working hand in hand to craft consistent policy messages that are amplified coherently across the entire government. And I just don't see how this budget request in any way prioritizes either diplomacy or development. When the Pentagon receives a $54 billion increase and the State Department receives a 32% decrease, I have a hard time hearing the argument that this is about efficiency and saving money for the taxpayers. The budget for Middle East and North Africa is by far the largest of the regional funds. And the Trump administration is proposing an 11% cut in bilateral aid to the Middle East and North Africa over the FY16 enacted levels. Most of these cuts are coming from our foreign military financing. The proposed restructuring of our FMF into one $200 million global fund that might be in the form of grants or might be in the form of loans is one of the most perplexing things about this budget proposal. I can't quite understand why we would pull this critical security assistance from countries desperately in need of it, like Tunisia and Lebanon. I don't understand what kind of message this sends when we tell a country that is our partner in the fight against terrorism that instead of a dedicated funding stream, we're going to somehow figure out who will get or how much they get from this new global pot of money. I'm also concerned that converting grants to loans would prevent poorer countries from getting the assistance they need to protect their and our own interests. So I'd like to better understand how you envision the decisions related to the global FMF fund to be made, how will the priorities be decided, who gets what, and what are we telling our allies who have been the recipients of these grants? I understand that budget numbers can be deceiving when it comes to pipelines and funding streams and allocations of prior year funds, but this proposal in no way seems to reflect the serious challenges that the region faces. Egypt, which has hundreds of millions of dollars sitting in the pipeline because we have a fundamental difference with the Egyptians on how economic support funds should be used, is still receiving $75 million in economic support funds? Where is the money going to be used, particularly after the government's decision to sign the restrictive new NGO law? How do these budget cuts reflect the need to bring stability or relief to Libya and Syria and Iraq and Yemen while continuing to push for a political solution to those conflicts? We should be pursuing robust programs that strengthen these countries and their people so they can resist extremist elements. How will the budget help to shore up Jordan, one of our most reliable partners in the fight against ISIS, whose economy is in terrible shape? The chairman and I continue to work to advance our legislation that would secure a new 5-year MOU for Jordan, as well as set up an enterprise fund, and I'd like to hear today about progress on both of these fronts. I will say I am pleased to see FMF for Israel and assistance to the Palestinians remain relatively steady. This support will be vital as the administration works toward a lasting peace that hopefully results in 2 states for 2 peoples. Finally, I am deeply concerned about the idea of folding USAID into the State Department, particularly when we hear that 40% of missions across the world would be closed. I am quite certain that Congress recognizes the value that our humanitarian, global health, and food security programs provide to our own national security. I understand that sometimes cuts are necessary, and we all want the government to run more efficiently. But simply cutting before evaluations of the efficiency and effectiveness of the department are completed seems, frankly, irresponsible, especially when our national security is at stake. I hope today you'll be able to address some of these concerns. Appreciate you being here, and I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Deutsch. Members will make their opening statements. Mr. Shabbat is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this very important hearing. There's no shortage of crises to discuss here today. In recent years, we have witnessed chaos ensue throughout the Middle East and much of North Africa, from seemingly endless civil war in Syria to the scourge of ISIS to a very flawed deal with Iran and on and on. And unfortunately, the new administration adopted a real mess. The region has become even more complicated due to massive immigration of refugees and Russia's increasing engagement there, and it just really does go on and on. Although we may be seeing some successes, such as the Iraq Army finally reconquering Mosul and our military taking a number of actions to target Syrian and Iranian-backed forces, most notably the strike in response to Assad's use of chemical weapons and the shooting down of a Syrian fighter plane last month, it appears Russia and Iranian forces will continue to cause trouble in the region into the foreseeable future. So that's something that has to be dealt with. Look forward to hearing the administration today. Thank you for holding this hearing.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Chairman Ros-Lehtinen and Ranking Member Deutsch, for calling this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for being here to discuss the important topic of U.S. priorities in the Middle East and North Africa for fiscal year 2018. The proposed cuts that President Trump has submitted to Congress are dangerous, short-sighted, and undermine the important role the United States plays in supporting peace and security in the region. It's critical that the United States has the funds necessary to support the current complicated, unstable conditions in the region, something the President's proposal clearly does not take into consideration. At a time when threats from ISIS are unrelenting, Syria continues to face an unimaginable humanitarian and refugee crisis, and the threat from Iran is ever looming, U.S. foreign assistance is more important than ever. The fiscal year 18 request fundamentally overlooks the threats to security and human life that affect countries throughout the Middle East and North Africa and America's leadership role in the world. And many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle have expressed their concerns over the proposed cuts, both to diplomatic and development funding. I look forward to the testimony of the witnesses today, and I thank you, Madam Chairman, and I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Cook of California.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. After reading this and looking at the President's budget, I'm very nervous. I'm on the House Armed Services Committee. Obviously, we're interested in the plus up on some of the military spending. But if we ignore our allies, our friends, anything else, particularly in this region, with these cuts, I think General Mattis said it, basically, we're going to be paying for more ammunition. And so what you have to say today is extremely important. And I think I've been very fortunate to be on both committees because You have to work together on that. You can't solve it with just bullets and bombs and everything else, that if we don't have the money there to help these countries, it is going to be in those terms that I described. So thank you very much for being here. I look forward to the hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. Mr. Kinzinger.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for being here. In case I don't get to ask questions, I just wanted to make a brief statement, which is I think not only executing the war on terror is important and using the funding to do that, but I think we're forgetting about what I call the next generational war on terror, which is the 7- and 8-year-olds that today are IDPs or that are in refugee camps that are denied opportunities to get an education or for hope or economic opportunity. And with the evil dictator Assad in power and denying this opportunity, I actually believe that Assad is the reason ISIS exists, and he's the continued incubator for ISIS. So there can be no defeat of radical terrorism in Syria with the existence of this dictator continuing to foster the conditions for this recruitment. But when we look at things like USAID, the importance of State Department and soft power exercise, I think we would be very remiss in a few years looking back to have ignored those tools in favor of just the military option, because we'd be finding ourselves fighting another generational war on terror. So with that, I'll yield back.
Good point. Thank you, Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I want to thank my colleague from Illinois for his thoughtful comments, because this is important. We are at a point in history where we have to be looking forward and dealing not just with the immediate threats such as ISIS, but the sources of those threats. And it's neutralizing these threats. It's going to the next step to stabilizing these regions, creating a future where there is hope. Right now, we are spending a lot of effort in dealing with people and helping people in crisis. We need to be, I believe, able to get to a point where we can go from helping people in crisis to helping people with good governance, with economic development, with education. And I'm very concerned, as has already been said, that we are cutting our budget at a time when the needs are growing. They're growing more diverse, they're growing more complex. And as others have said, if we cut our budget on diplomacy, if we cut our budget on development, it's going to impact what we have to do on defense. So as you address these questions, I look forward to hearing your answers, and I will also echo the concern that here we are 6 months into the year, and you're still with the titles of acting. So thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. Ms. Frankel of Florida.
Thank you. And thank you, both of you, for your service. And I apologize, you have to hear our frustration. So the world is a dangerous place, and I heard that our president said he is inheriting a mess. Well, guess what? His budget is making a mess. That's my opinion. And his own defense secretary says something to the effect that we can't gain peace and security just with bombs and bullets. And I don't know how we are going to even explain to our military personnel or their families that have sent them to places, I'll use Iraq as an example, where we spend billions of dollars to so-called, quote, win a war when we know a country has to become stable, eventually with development and diplomacy. And this budget fails in that respect. So I hope you'll be able to explain these cuts. And again, thank you for your service. And I yield back.
Thank you, and thank you to all the members, and thank you especially to our witnesses, because we will have a series of votes coming up shortly, and in the interest of time, they have agreed to not give their opening statements. I will introduce them, and then we will go right to questions, and I will start with Mr. Shabbat. So first, we're delighted to welcome back the Acting Assistant Secretary of State for the Near East Affairs Bureau, Ambassador Stuart Jones. Ambassador Jones previously served as the United States Ambassador to Iraq and Jordan. I've had the honor of visiting him in both countries. He's a good friend. Prior to this, he served in a variety of positions in places like Turkey, El Salvador, Colombia, and in our mission at the UN. It's good to see you again, Mr. Ambassador, and congratulations on your upcoming retirement. Thank you for your 30 years of service, and I hope that you and Barbara enjoy retirement. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to hearing your testimony. Well, we look forward to reading your testimony and asking your questions. And we're delighted to welcome back another good friend, Maria Longi Ms. Longi is USAID's Acting Assistant Administrator of the Bureau for the Middle East. Previously, she served as the Deputy Assistant Administrator for USAID's Middle East Bureau, and prior to joining USAID, Ms. Longi served as the Director for Management, Policy, and Resources in the State Department Bureau of International Organization Affairs. So welcome back. We look forward to you answering our questions, and with that, we will begin the question and answer period with Mr. Shabbat of Ohio.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And first question would be, this past weekend at the G20 summit, ceasefire was announced for portions of southern Syria to be overseen by the United States and Russia. However, the ceasefire only covers a small portion, as we know, of Syria, and many details remain somewhat unclear. Would you be so kind as to outline the terms of the ceasefire and how we expect it to be enforced? And does the ceasefire prevent Iran or Hezbollah from establishing a presence in the ceasefire areas?
Thank you, Congressman. First, Madam Chairman, thank you for your kind words, and thank you for your friendship and your support through these many years. And your announcement also has been a loss for the House, so thank you very much. Congressman, in regards to the ceasefire that was announced last week, this represents an agreement between the United States, Jordan, and Russia to establish a ceasefire in the southwestern quadrant of Syria. And the idea is, of course, initially to establish a ceasefire, but ultimately to create conditions in that area where people could start to return to their homes, where we would be able to deliver humanitarian assistance, and we would be able to create stability. Certainly, an essential element of that is to have no forces threatening the line of demarcation, whether they be Syrian regime forces or Iranian forces or Hezbollah forces. So that is certainly part of the expectation. That said, some of the details are still to be worked out, and we're still working through the mechanics of this. But since the ceasefire was announced last Thursday, we have seen now several days of genuine stability and peace in that vicinity. Right before I got here, I got a report from Michael Ratney, our Deputy Assistant Secretary, who participated in that negotiation. He said the reports today from the area around Daraa, in this area where the ceasefire has been declared, that the ceasefire is holding effectively. So this is good news for us.
Thank you very much. In the past, Iran and North Korea have cooperated, as we know, in missile development. What's the current state, do we believe, of ballistic missile cooperation between Iran and North Korea?
Thank you again, Congressman. So the Iranian development of ballistic missiles, we believe, is a significant threat to stability in the Middle East. This is in complete violation of UN Security Council Resolution 2231. We know that the Iranians are providing ballistic missiles and ballistic missile technology to the Houthis, which is adding to the conflict in Yemen. And there are other instances, too, where the Iranians are providing the ballistic missile technology to Hezbollah and other terrorist organizations in the region. I'm sorry, I'm not prepared to speak to you about the nexus between North Korea and Iran, but clearly Iran is an evil partner in this arrangement.
Thank you. And finally, let me turn to ISIS. Obviously, Mosul has just fallen, although there are, I guess, a few things still to wrap up here and there. But overall, it looks like the Iraqi forces, with our assistance and others, have won out there. And I would assume that Raqqa will be soon. And the question is, I assume the administration is planning on what happens with those who either go back to their country or go elsewhere, who will continue the terror in other parts of the world. What's the planning going on there, to the extent that you can tell us in an open forum like that?
Well, thanks for the question again, because it's very timely. Today at the State Department, we are hosting a meeting of political directors from all of the coalition members. And a key focus of this discussion has been, what are we going to do about the foreign fighters who are going to be now leaving the theater in Iraq and Syria? There's a great deal of concern, as you would expect, in Southeast Asia. I had the Deputy Foreign Minister of Australia in my office yesterday talking about this very topic. How can we cooperate to make sure that we are sharing information and identifying these foreign fighters as they cross borders and present threats to other regions? So this is something that's very much under our attention. We're working closely with DoD partners. We are, of course, focusing on terrorist finance aspects through the Department of Treasury. This is a whole-of-government approach. And again, this is something that was highlighted during the President's Summit in Riyadh back in May. The GCC countries, and indeed all of the Muslim countries who attended the broader summit, pledged to support efforts to counter terrorism financing, to counter terroristic and extremist messaging, and also to counter the flow of foreign fighters across borders.
Thank you. My time's expired.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. There has been a lot of attention on Capitol Hill paid to the so-called Palestinian martyr payments. And we all abhor this practice of incentivizing and rewarding terrorism. It certainly does nothing to advance the prospects for peace that we all desire. I have raised this issue directly with Palestinian Authority leaders on multiple occasions. It has been on the agenda for President Trump and his advisors in their meetings with President Abbas and other Palestinian officials. Yesterday, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee held a hearing on the Taylor Force Act. The legislation in its current form would bar aid from all West Bank and Gaza programs until a certification could be made that these payments have ceased. Now is clearly the time for action. There is momentum in Congress and in the administration, and many of our allies around the world have joined in decrying these payments. The witnesses at yesterday's hearing offered a number of suggested revisions to the legislation that would ensure that we maintain Israel's security, such as withholding PA debt payments or setting aside the money as incentive for the PA to retrieve it once changes to the practice are made. Does the department have a view on these potential paths forward so that the United States Congress can move ahead with the Taylor Force Act and finally move on legislation aimed at stopping these payments to terrorists?
Thank you, Congressman, and also thank you for your kind words. And I've appreciated your visits to my various embassies and very much appreciate your friendship. Of course, the administration shares Congress's commitment to ending the programs that incentivize acts of terrorism. President Trump has discussed this issue directly with President Abbas, emphasizing the need to make significant progress on this issue. And in fact, we have seen some progress. For the first time in the 52 years of the Palestinians' prisoner payment program, the Palestinian Authority cut funding to 277 Hamas-affiliated former prisoners last month. Now, that's not sufficient. None of us think that's sufficient, but it is a step forward. We know they have to do more. It is not clear that the Taylor Force Act, as currently drafted, would help accomplish the objectives that are needed. But I agree with you that the hearing yesterday was very constructive, some interesting ideas proposed. The administration has not yet taken a position on those proposals.
I appreciate that. I would urge the administration to look closely at some of those proposals to see if there's a way that we can move forward on this quickly. Small investments in programs like the Middle East Regional Cooperation Program, which started over 35 years ago, which helped foster cooperation between Israel and our Arab neighbors, can go a long way. This particular program has never received more than $5 million, and it brings together researchers from across the region. Why, at a time when the White House seems to be pushing a regional approach to peace, would we zero out a program like this?
Thank you for your question, and thank you for all of your support for and words for USAID and for development and humanitarian assistance. We appreciate hearing that. The Middle East Regional Cooperation Program was zeroed out. I will say they do some wonderful programs, and there are a significant number of grants in their pipeline. So as a practical matter, that program can continue for a little while. We do have several other cooperation programs in the Middle East with the Israelis and Palestinians that we implement between civil society groups, between educators, between businesses. So while this is one of the programs where we do have cooperation between the different players, we do have others that do support that objective.
I know that we do. I would also point out it's a decision to make a small cut to a program that will effectively be eliminated, a program that contributes to peace, and I would urge you to reconsider that. I'm deeply concerned. I wanted to follow up on Mr. Shabbat's point. I'm deeply concerned that the administration has been willing to let Russia lead in Syria, and Russia's shown no willingness to divorce itself from Assad, from Iran, or from Hezbollah. You had spoken about the current ceasefire, but I'd like to just look ahead and ask whether the United States would ever agree to a political solution that allows a sustained Iranian or Hezbollah military presence in Syria.
Like you, Congressman, we're very troubled by the Iranian military presence, by the Hezbollah presence in Syria. This is a significant risk and poses a terrible threat to stability, not only in Syria, but to the entire region. So we're very troubled by that. Our engagement with Russia is aimed at reducing the levels of violence inside of Syria today. And so far, if this ceasefire in the southwestern Syria holds, that would be a step forward in terms of the reduction in violence and just trying to improve people's lives at a very basic level. In parallel, the Russians have established a process called the Astana process, in which they're working with the Iranians and the Turks. And they've also, in that forum, proposed 3 other de-escalation areas to reduce the levels of violence. And indeed, since they proposed those areas, we have seen a reduction in violence in those areas. So we will work with the Russians if they continue to be able to help us reduce the levels of violence in these areas. Hopefully, as we reduce areas of violence, we can create greater levels of stability, we can provide more humanitarian assistance, and then the idea is to move towards a political process. And we hope that that political process will remove Bashar al-Assad.
Well, I understand. Let me just be clear, though. I understand the step-by-step approach. But my question was about a political solution, about a long-term plan, and I would suggest to you respectfully that the idea that there can be stability in Syria with a permanent presence of Iran and Hezbollah is not a serious one, and that's what I'm suggesting.
And I'm sorry, I should have said that I agree with you. We agree on this point. There cannot be stability in Syria as long as Iran and Hezbollah maintain this current military presence. That's our position as well.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you both.
Mr. Deutsch. Thank you. Mr. Cook of California.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. My questions are about, there's a whole laundry list of countries here that we could address, but let me start off with, there's 2 I want to talk about. Bahrain and the huge cut in a country where obviously our military, the fleet is stationed right there. Anyone who's ever gone there, they know how important that is. And then you have the situation with a government that's primarily Sunni with the majority of the population Shia. And I'm afraid that's on the, at least my watch list for future problems from Iran, what have you. And could you comment on that situation? And of course, to see that cut there, it's like, wait a minute, does anybody know what's going on and whether you share my angst in that regard?
Thank you, Congressman. We certainly agree that Bahrain is an important security partner for the United States. It's the base of the 6th Fleet. It's an important partner in the coalition against ISIS. It's playing a role in the Saudi-led coalition on Yemen. We have important security interests and investments in Bahrain. Bahrain also faces tremendous security challenges. I was there recently in March. I met with the Minister of Interior. He told me that in the last year, he had lost 50 police officers to Iranian-sponsored terrorism in Bahrain. So we need to stand by Bahrain. Again, we will have this this global foreign military financing fund where we will have the flexibility to support our partners as needed going forward. The Pentagon will also have funds, counter-ISIS funds, through which they can support programs in Bahrain. And also, to a great degree, Bahrain can support its own security, and it also receives significant support from its Gulf partners. So I'm confident that there will be no gaps in our approach to Bahrain. We are concerned about human rights in Bahrain, but this administration has delinked the conversation on human rights to our security support. We're still talking about human rights. We're very concerned about the arrests of dissidents and the lack of due process, but we have delinked that from the important security support that you mentioned.
Thank you. The other country I wanted to talk about was Tunisia. You know, I look at the figures for Libya, and I understand that. But Tunisia, you know, where the Arab Spring and everything like that, where it all started, and I was there a year, 2 years ago, and saw the remnants where they shot up the museum and things like that. And more telling, at least from an economic standpoint, are all the beach resorts and the cruise ships that are now in Croatia or what have you. And the whole economy is just basically hurting, and it's very, very worried about that country. And this, my thoughts on this were reinforced. I was just in Italy a few months ago, and the Italians are very worried about the human trafficking coming from sub-Saharan Africa, through Libya, through Tunisia, some of those countries that are, you know, landing every night there. And once again, basically the same question. Do you share my same anxiety about that country where, in many ways, that was our hope for the future for the Arab region?
Thank you, Congressman. As you say, Tunisia is an important partner for the United States. Prime Minister Chabad was here this week. He met with the Vice President. He met with Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Treasury. The Tunisians have been doing a terrific job. They're building democratic institutions. They're defeating ISIS. They definitely merit our support. I think this budget reflects significant support for Tunisia. We've straight-lined our economic support funds with the exception of just $20 million. That reflects the fact that we've paid up the enterprise fund commitment in Tunisia, and the enterprise fund is succeeding in Tunisia. We also, thanks to the support of Congress, were able to provide $40 million in supplemental FY17 funds in counter-ISIS funds to Tunisia. 30 million of that is FMF, so that is money that will be going into the system relatively soon. Tunisia, as the chairman mentioned, although we have not, this budget does not provide for FMF in FY18, Tunisia will be a high priority recipient under the global FMF fund, $200 million FMF fund. I think all of us recognize the principles that you've outlined, that we need to stand with Tunisia. Let me just say very quickly, too, Tunisia will also continue to qualify for DOD 333 funds, also DOD CTEF funds, and also Tunisia is now the beneficiary of a MCC, Millennium Challenge Corporation, compact agreement, which will bring a significant U.S. investment, multi-$100 million investment in infrastructure into Tunisia. So I think we can say we're standing by the Tunisians.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. And before I recognize Mr. Cicilline, we're going to be cutting the time for a Q&A to 4 minutes because we want to give as many members the opportunity to ask questions before the votes are called. Mr. Cicilline is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to our witnesses, and not only for your service, but for the service of the men and women you represent. And I regret that we're living in a time where there's such an absence of leadership in important positions in both your agencies. But I'm going to just quickly move to my question. First is, ISIS control over Syrian land has drastically reduced over the past year, particularly, of course, in the northern part of the country. How does the budget that is being presented today support the humanitarian aid which will be necessary to promote stability in these areas, and what can we do and what does the budget support to ensure that these areas are not really taken advantage of by new and different extremist groups going forward?
Thank you for your question. I can start on the humanitarian and development support that we can provide through this budget, primarily in Iraq and Syria, which is where the issues are most prominent right now. I think the request on the humanitarian accounts will continue to support the needs that we are seeing in both Iraq and Syria. Just this week, we announced another $190 million for the humanitarian crisis in Syria, so we will continue to support that issue. In Syria, the U.S. government has already provided over $6 billion since the Syria crisis began on the humanitarian front. And as with Iraq, we have requested sufficient funds, we believe, to continue to support those needs. The requests on the stabilization front, we're anticipating that those needs will be great. The estimates that we're hearing from Mosul right now, just this week with the coalition in town, are upwards of $1 billion. We just announced a contribution of $150 million to the UNDP stabilization fund there, and so we are working very hard to encourage other coalition partners to contribute as well, and hopefully we will be successful on that front because they are already seeing returnees because of some of the stabilization efforts that they've made. In Syria, the stabilization effort, I believe we've requested funding in our budget for that. The landscape is unknown for a lot of that now, but I think our goal and what we're discussing with our coalition partners is focuses on stabilization once areas are liberated. And so we are all working to tee up partners to do that work and funding.
Thank you. As Iran and North Korea are enhancing their abilities to disrupt military communications and navigation in order to degrade information networks, does the fiscal year 2018 budget propose enough spending to fight this global threat of electronic warfare by two of our most serious adversaries?
Could you repeat that?
Sure. There are both North Korea and Iran are enhancing their capabilities to disrupt military communications and navigation in order to degrade information networks. And does the fiscal year 2018 budget propose enough spending to fight the looming global threat that these adversaries present through electronic warfare?
So I apologize, Congressman. I'm not well prepared on what we're doing on electronic warfare. Those activities wouldn't come out of the NEA budget, but I can assure you that this is a topic of frequent discussion in the interagency, and both the Pentagon, our intelligence services, and others are looking at these issues and are preparing approaches.
Thank you. And my final question, according to Freedom House, freedom in the world has been in decline over the last decade. The president's request for democracy, rights, and governance is down to $1.5 billion, a reduction of more than $700 million, and 30% compared to the $2.3 billion appropriated by Congress in fiscal years 2016 and 2017. And my question really is, how does the president's request, that dramatic reduction, reflect our country's commitment to democracy, human rights, and good governance at a time when the threat of instability, violent extremism, intolerance, and authoritarianism seem to threaten more and more people around the world? It seems as if we're retreating from that work by this very substantial reduction in this budget proposal, and I'd like to hear your response to that, please.
Thank you. I can say from USAID's perspective that democracy and human rights is no less of an emphasis for us as we go forward.
I understand, but can you do the work that's necessary with a 30% reduction?
In the Middle East region, we have not requested a 30% reduction, so hopefully that we're confident that the funds that are there will allow us to do what we're able to do in these countries. As you acknowledge that the space is getting tighter and it makes it more difficult, which makes us have to kind of up our game on the diplomacy and the conversation part with the countries. But I think assistance-wise, we have sufficient funds to do this.
Thank you, Mr. Ros-Lehtinen, and we regret that votes have just been called. We have 11 votes, but I think that we'll be able to get in Mr. Kinzinger and Ms. Frankel's questions, and I would ask the members to submit their questions in writing. Mr. Kinzinger.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and again, thank you all for being here. I was actually watching a cable news show yesterday, and that's not one I usually watch, and there was a respected scholar, Max Boot, on it, and in that exchange with this cable news host was talking about basically how wonderful it would be to work with the Russians in the Middle East, and how, the Iranians actually aren't really all that bad, and said that, there was no terrorist attack by the Iranians against Americans in the United States, although Mr. Boot reminded him that there were about 900 dead Americans from Iraq as a result of Iranian involvement and influence. And I say all that to say there's this kind of really kind of sick narrative out there that We no longer need to fight for values and human rights and beliefs and freedom, which is very counter to the President Reagan, that I became a Republican because of. And now it's this idea that we lean again on strongmen and that dictators can keep order in the Middle East and that somehow oppressing human desires is possible even in the age of technology when people can communicate and come together. I think, when you make the case on Syria, for instance, people often point to Libya as a disastrous result, and there's huge challenges in Libya. I would argue that it was our leaving Libya afterwards that's been a big problem. But if I compare Libya to Syria, there's no comparison in terms of which is the bigger tragedy. Syria, there was no intervention. Libya, there was intervention. Much different of a situation. I say all that to ask this. Instead of relying on other countries and encouraging them to use military hard power to oppress humans and bomb hospitals and kill 500,000 Syrians in this case, as I mentioned in my opening statement, it's about winning over the next generation. We're engaged in a war that's going to take us longer than the Cold War. The Cold War was won not because we had a great military, we did, but it was won because multiple generations began to reject the philosophy of communism and desire more. That's what's going to happen in this fight. So I guess the question for both of you is, when we talk about the next generational war on terror, we talk about the budget request, we talk about giving people hope and opportunity, not all just us, but working and leveraging our allies and partners in the region together, do we have sufficient enough resources and strategy to engage in that understanding that this is a long-term fight? When ISIS flag falls, there's still going to be this ideology, and see this through to the end. I'll start with you, Ambassador.
Well, thank you, Congressman. And I think if we look at what happened in May, the Riyadh summit, where the President met first with the Saudis, and then with the GCC, and then with the broader Islamic community. And in all of those sessions, they mutually agreed to fight extremism, to counter extremism, to defeat terrorism, and also to stand up against the malign Iranian influence that is destabilizing the region, that's caused so many deaths and destruction in Syria. So I think that the Riyadh summit was a historic event, and I think it's important to look at what came out of those meetings, and that has created a platform for this administration to move forward. In the GCC, although there's been this falling out with Qatar, we still have a document that creates a platform for both counterterrorism and counter-extremism cooperation, but also security cooperation throughout the region, blunting the malign influence of Iran, and working together to build those economies. As you know, one of the deliverables from the President's visit to Riyadh was the establishment of the EventID Center for Counter-Extremism in Riyadh. The director of the center is here this week. He's been meeting with U.S. government officials all week. He's taking back new ideas. And this is not just about stopping negative messages in the cybersphere. This is about addressing the core issues that you've raised in your question. So I think it's exactly where we are. Sorry.
Thank you. Excellent question. Thank you for the answer. Ms. Frankel of Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me start by saying that the ignorance of the State Department budget is appalling and frightening. We're withdrawing from the world at a time when our leadership is needed more than ever, and butting up with Vladimir Putin is not a substitute for a well-thought-out plan for peace and security. I'm not going to ask you any questions because you're here to defend what I think is the indefensible, and I think you two are just very fine public servants, and I don't want to do that. So I'm going to yield to the rest of my time to Mr. Schneider, who wants to take a shot at asking you a question.
Thank you. I appreciate the moments, and I appreciate your service to our country and you being here to discuss. Two things. One, what was spoken about earlier with the ceasefire negotiated in southwestern Syria and the idea of presence of Iranian troops, Hezbollah troops there. Are you aware? This ceasefire, I assume, includes Daraa, where this started. And I don't know how we can have a process that's going to lead to peace by having the same people who have oppressed an entire nation because 15 young children spoke out against the government. And yet there it is. And it includes the area to the west of Daraa along the Damascus-Amman highway, which not only borders Jordan but borders Israel. And the idea of Iranian troops, the possibility of them ever being there is of grave concern. So I guess that's a statement more than a question. My question is, budgets reflect our values, they reflect our goals, they ultimately in theory, should reflect our strategy. It seems to me that this budget is a budget developed first with numbers, and then we'll see if the strategy follows. So to each of you, given the draconian cuts, I'll argue indefensible, unwise, misguided cuts of this budget, what impacts is that going to have on A, the ability to achieve our goals? Are we changing our goals? And B, the strategy that follows to achieve those goals?
Yes, thank you. I think that this budget, the budget for the Middle East, I think, is reflective and supportive of our goals. I'm not going to speak to the FM, the military piece of this, but on the development and the stabilization piece, I do think that we've asked for sufficient resources to support what our goals are, and those include defeating ISIS and stabilizing the regions afterwards, as well as the longer-term development goals in the countries such as Jordan and Egypt, and countries where there is more stability and the ability to do that.
And if I may, and I'm sorry to interject, but because of time, defeating ISIS is critical. We have to defeat ISIS. It is a milestone. It's not the end post. The end post is a region that is stable, a region that is not a threat to the countries around it and to the United States.
And I'll just add on that, so in our strategic planning and thinking about the assistance, how we spend the assistance in these countries, we do look longer term to the development impacts. And so we're not just doing the immediate stabilization work, we are looking at primary education and jobs creations and things that do have a longer term impact.
I guess, Ambassador Jones, to put you on the spot, and I wish you great happiness in your retirement. We will miss you. But as you look back on your career, the budget being proposed, is it going to make your successors and those who come, the men and women who put their lives on the line day in and day out, working on behalf of our nation as diplomats in development, is your job going to be easier, or is it going to be more difficult?
Well, thank you for your kind words. So speaking for NEA, speaking for the Middle East Bureau, we're looking at 11% cut here. I think we've been able to digest these cuts. Clearly, I think there's concern about the zeroing out of some of the foreign military financing accounts. We will look at how to address that through the $200 million FMF Global Fund.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you, Brad.
Sorry.
I know that your wife Barbara is itching to have you leave as well. But we have
Thank you.
2 minutes left to vote, and with that, the subcommittee is adjourned. Thank you for your testimony. Thank you. Let's go get it.
Sorry, your vote Rex from Chris.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you. Hey, hey, hey.